This is the M4 iPad Pro, Apple's thinnest and most powerful tablet made to date. The question is, does all this innovation really matter? Since picking this up last May, I've taken this device through a variety of scenarios, from using it for design and illustration, to taking notes, editing photos, watching content, playing games, you name it. And while it does do a lot of those things amazingly well, I have had some issues with it. On top of that, a lot has been updated since the M4 iPad Pro was released. iPadOS 18 is now available, including Apple Intelligence, and the general experience is changing a lot in some areas. Today, I want to dive into what that whole experience has been like so far, including a lot of those changes. So if you want to know more about my long-term use with the newest Pro iPad from Apple, stick around and let's get into it. This video is sponsored by ESR. Hey everyone, Kyle Erickson here. I've been using the M4 iPad Pro for the last 6 months or so, and since the time it was released, a lot has changed with this device. iPadOS 18 was announced and released, with Apple Intelligence features slowly rolling out. And while a lot of that stuff has had an effect on how I use my iPad, what initially sold me on the M4 Pro was the hardware and design itself. The version that I have here is the 11-inch base model in space black that is only 5.3 millimeters thick and weighs in at 446 grams, which is kinda crazy given all that's packed in here. I was a little concerned with how durable this would be long-term because of just how thin it is, and that the darker color would be prone to scratches and marks, especially around the USB-C port, but up to this point, it's held up incredibly well. It hasn't bent or had any damage or visible wear, which is pretty impressive given that I have carted this around with me quite a bit, both with and without a case or a keyboard. And areas where there are a high amount of friction, like the USB-C port and where the pencil clips on, are still good as new. If you are using it without a case or a keyboard, the thinness of the iPad can make the pencil a little harder to keep attached versus thicker iPads, because the pencil is much wider than the tablet itself, so it's easier to bump or knock loose, although I do find the magnets are a lot stronger than some other tablets that I've tried, and still more secure comparatively. Also, if you do ever bump it off, the Apple Pencil Pro that works with the M4 iPad Pro does have Find My if you lose it, which thankfully I've never had to use, but that pencil has been one of my favorite things to use with all the new iPad models. Functionally, just for writing and drawing, it doesn't feel all that different from the previous gen pencil, but the thing that I constantly use on here is the barrel clicking to bring up the pencil UI, where I can undo things that I've written or change pencil tips, which is super useful. When I'm doing research for these videos, I often prefer to split out views with Stage Manager, so I'll have a video or an article open on one side of the screen with a Notes app open on the other. That way I can just jot down my notes as I watch, because I just find that I tend to remember or absorb more of the information if I'm physically writing it down. I also use the Pencil Pro to sketch out designs for 3D prints, and more recently, I've been trying to incorporate it while I make wallpapers, and it's definitely something that I've come to rely on quite a bit. That being said, there are times where I'll want to use the iPad Pro in more of a traditional laptop setup, which is what I'll often use the new Magic Keyboard for, and that has definitely improved over the last generation. This is currently only compatible with the iPad Pro, but you've now got a full aluminum keyboard and palm rest, with the back cover being this durable rubber texture, which I will say does collect a lot of dust, but the overall build quality of the Magic Keyboard is great. On the keyboard itself, there's now a function row, which makes this a lot more usable, and there's also an updated trackpad that's larger and has better multi-touch functionality, but I have had some issues with it. Sometimes in Safari, I'm not able to click buttons or links with a trackpad, and for whatever reason, I'll have to use the touch screen to hit them. And sometimes the scrolling can stick or not work properly on some pages. I would say those things are more annoyances than anything, and for the most part, when I'm doing those things, I don't really need the Magic Keyboard, but When I do, it's more for things like writing scripts for these videos, creating documents, or technical notes that I plan on sharing with other people. I normally do most of that stuff at my desk, but sometimes it does get a bit stale, and I like to get out and do that somewhere else. With the iPad Pro being super portable, it's really well positioned for being able to use pretty much anywhere, but personally, for me, it just leans a little too far into the iOS style controls to use it on a more regular basis. A lot of apps feel super basic and are obviously made for iOS first and then have been adapted for iPad, and how everything works just feels like too much of a departure from macOS. On top of that, the Magic Keyboard is a whopping $299 USD, which when you pair it with the 11-inch base iPad Pro, is the same price as the 13-inch M3 MacBook Air with 16 gigs of RAM, and even more when you tack on a pencil. For a lot of folks, that doesn't really make much sense, and you can still use the on-screen keyboard for simple things like responding to emails or texting. And if that's all you're doing, or you're just looking for a solid case or a stand for your iPad, ESR has a fantastic option that's much more affordable. This is the ESR Shift magnetic case, and this is one of the most versatile, well-designed cases that you'll find for an iPad. Not only do you have this case that slips onto the iPad Pro that gives you a good amount of protection, you also get this detachable magnetic back that easily connects and allows you to view your iPad from up to 9 different angles. I've seen cases try and do this before, but this is much more stable in each angle and a lot easier to adjust for that matter. It's simple to go from landscape to portrait orientation, and there's some great little details like having a groove for your Apple Pencil so it's not going to move around on you as easily, and a place to store it when you're traveling. The best part about it is it's only a fraction of the cost of something like the Magic Keyboard, and it's still much cheaper than a lot of other cases and stands. So if you're looking for something that gives you a lot of versatility in how you can use your iPad while offering great protection, please check out the link in the description. I would say 99% of the time, that kind of case is really all that I need because in most situations, a physical keyboard isn't necessary. When I use the iPad Pro, I would say I spend the majority of my time consuming media, taking calls, or using it casually around the house. And for that, it's been outstanding, largely because of the display. Both the 11 and 13-inch iPad Pro M4s have the new tandem OLED panel, which I found looks and works better than pretty much every other display that I've used in a tablet or laptop. With the OLED display, you get those deep blacks, the colors really pop, and this can go all the way up to 1000 nits peak brightness with SDR content, and 1600 with HDR, which makes this viewable in almost every scenario, including direct sunlight. I've been asked if I see any grain with the darker parts of the image, and there's been nothing that I've personally noticed. Everything has been super clean and sharp, and I have absolutely no complaints. Right above that OLED for the very first time on the iPad Pro is a landscape-oriented camera, which is much nicer and less awkward than the old portrait-oriented ones. Because of that placement, I prefer to take calls on this versus at my desk setup because, again, it's super portable and I can use it anywhere, but it's also better quality than the studio display in both the front-facing camera and the audio with a built-in 4-mic array on the iPad Pro. When it comes to the rear camera, I'll occasionally use that for scanning documents, which I will say works amazingly well with the adaptive True Tone flash that removes shadows from the documents and provides you with a pretty clean scan considering it's just a photo. With that in mind, photos themselves aren't really worth taking most of the time and are nowhere near the quality of images coming off an iPhone. But ironically, photo editing is one of my favorite things to do on this iPad. The M4 in the iPad Pro has absolutely no issues when editing photos in Lightroom or Affinity Photo, and with a great display and the Apple Pencil, I think I prefer editing photos on this over all my other devices. It's super smooth without any lag, and using the pencil for masking and adjustments is just a joy to use, both in here and pretty much any other creative app that I use as it relates to creating or editing images. Even with more resource-heavy tasks like video editing, the M4 iPad Pro can cut through most of those without any issues with it having a full-blown media engine just like the M-series chips in the Macs. I honestly don't use it much for that outside of testing or if I'm out on the go, but I do personally know people who use the iPad Pro pretty much exclusively with video editing in DaVinci Resolve with very few hangups. I just prefer to use Final Cut Pro on Mac, and I'm not a huge fan of the iPad version. The same goes for gaming, where I don't normally do much of that at home, but like I've said in other videos, it's kind of fun to pop in here and game if you're traveling. This runs through everything that I've played in the Apple Arcade just fine, and titles like Assassin's Creed Mirage, which struggled on the iPad mini that I looked at last week, have zero issues here. Assassin's Creed Mirage came out shortly after the iPad Pro M4 was released, as did the new game mode with iPadOS 18 that will optimize the iPad for playing games. And there are a host of new things with iPadOS 18 that have had a pretty big effect on how I use the Pro. First off, I love being able to further customize my home screen icons and layout natively because I think it looks so much better than the standard view. But for me, that's really the tip of the iceberg. When I'm browsing in Safari, I use the new Hide Items feature all the time to hide ads and UI on certain web pages. I use the new emoji tapbacks and text styles in the Messages app quite often, but the most powerful tools that I've found are actually in the Notes app, where I honestly spend a lot of my time on the iPad Pro. What I love about the Notes app now is not only can I sketch out ideas for things that I might want to 3D print, but I can actually do the math for those right inside of here with a new Math Notes feature. And brand new here just this week, we got our first taste of Apple Intelligence with writing tools. Admittedly, given this was just released and I hadn't played around with it beforehand, this is still pretty fresh, but I've already been using this to proofread some of my writing. You can also rewrite documents with different tones, summarize text and audio recordings, and having this natively integrated into iPadOS and really every Apple operating system is something that I'm definitely looking forward to exploring more. We now have the new Siri animation on the screen as well, which to my knowledge in the current 18.1 build is mostly just a facelift utilizing the pre-existing Siri on the back end, which will be updated at a later date, but it is exciting to see some of that stuff finally show up here. The image generation and more advanced features are still a ways out, and I want to do more of a general overview of Apple Intelligence once everything is released and out of beta. But there are still a few things outside of everything new here that I wish would get updated or that are still a bit buggy. The Files app is still one thing that feels a bit disconnected from the operating system, where I wish there was a little bit better integration between it and things like the Photos app. Right now, say if I connect an external drive to my iPad, I can't see any pictures or videos that are on my device from the Files app, and they're just in Photos, which I do find a bit frustrating. Also, I've had this same bug in the Files app ever since the iPad Pro M4 came out, where sometimes I'll connect my external SSD and remove it, and then I'll plug it back in and it won't be recognized, and I'll have to restart the iPad for it to show up, so I'd really like to see that get cleaned up. Speaking of external drives, you do only have the one USB-C port on here, which does limit you to some extent in terms of what you can connect directly to the iPad, but the specs on that port are fantastic. You get Thunderbolt or USB 4 speeds up to 40 gigabits per second, so that pretty much destroys the bandwidth available compared to any other iPad model. It can also support external displays up to 6K at 60 Hz, so this will work with the Studio display or even a Pro XDR display without any issues. For me, that comes in handy not so much for the speed on a single accessory or using it as a desktop, but for when I want to hook up multiple things to the iPad Pro via a USB hub, which I use on occasion. With something like that, I know that I can retain a decent amount of speed across a number of ports versus something like the iPad Air where you've got a quarter of the speed that the Pro has. Again, that's not something that I reach for very often, but I still think it's worth mentioning for folks who do like the idea of running an iPad in more of a desktop setup, which this by far exceeds what any other iPad model can do. But for me, when it comes to connectivity, I mostly just stick to wireless, whether that be with external accessories or with file transfers. Like any other of my Apple products over the last couple of years, I've had zero issues with anything there, from Wi-Fi connectivity to Bluetooth connections. Wi-Fi speeds have been great, and even with things like AirDrop, I've had almost no connection issues or failures. Any kind of continuity features like universal control have worked really well, and I really have nothing to complain about there. That's the same kind of story with battery life where, again, I've been shocked at how good the battery life has been on here given just how thin the M4 iPad Pro is. On a regular day, say if I'm writing a script or watching content, taking notes, those types of tasks, this can last me almost 2 full days on a single charge, which is far better than my phone and most laptops for that matter. Now, if you start doing more resource-intensive things like gaming or video editing, it's gonna suck back the battery a lot faster, which really isn't any different than any other device, but just for casual use and getting some work done here and there, this is an amazing tablet. I guess the tricky part for me is, I'm not sure it's amazing enough to justify the price tag of $9.99 USD, which is even more with accessories like the Magic Keyboard and Apple Pencil. I think if you're using it a lot for illustration or you're doing a lot of video editing and things of that nature, it probably does make sense, or even if you're not so much concerned with the price but you want a super sleek tablet with an amazing display, you're not going to be disappointed. For me, even with all the great stuff on here, I have to be honest, I'm kind of enjoying the iPad mini 7 a lot more right now due to the form factor, but I would love to know, just how important are these features to you, and do you think that the iPad Pro M4 is worth it over the other current models or even the older Pro versions? Let me know in the comments down below. That's all I have for you today. I hope you enjoyed this video or you found it useful. If you did, feel free to hit that like button. If you'd like to see more tech-related content or help me make an iPad where Siri only responds to you if you use Shakespearean English, please subscribe. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next upload.